Watership Down, Chapter 49. Hazel Comes Home. And although Woundwort had shown himself, at the last, to be a creature virtually mad, nevertheless, what he did proved not altogether futile. There can be very little doubt that if he had not done it, more rabbits would have been killed that morning on Watership Down. So swiftly and silently had the dog come up the hill behind Dandelion and Blackberry, that one of Campion's sentries, half asleep, under a clump of bushes after the long night, was pulled down and killed in the instant that he turned to bolt. Later, after it had left Woundwort, the dog beat up and down the bank and the open grass for some time, barking and dashing at every bush, but by now the Afrafans had had time to scatter and hide as best they could. And besides, the dog, unexpectedly scratched and bitten, showed a certain reluctance to come to grips. And at last, however, it succeeded in putting up and killing the rabbit who had been wounded by glass the day before. And with this, it made off by the way it had come, disappearing over the edge of the hill. There could be no question now of the Afrafans renewing their attack on the warren. None had any idea beyond saving his own life. Their leader was gone. The dog had been set upon them by the rabbits they had come to kill. Of this they were sure, and it was all one with the mysterious fox and the white bird. Indeed, Ragwort, the most unimaginative rabbit alive, had actually heard it underground. Campion, crouching in a patch of nettles with Vervain and 4 or 5 more, met with nothing but shivering agreement when he said that he was sure they ought to leave this place at once, this dangerous place where they had already stayed far too long. Without Campion, probably not one rabbit would have got back to Ephrata. As it was, all his skill as a patroller could not bring home half of those that had left. 3 or 4 had run and strayed too far to be found, and what became of them no one ever knew. There were probably 14 or 15 rabbits, no more, who set off with Campion, some time before Nefrith, to try to retrace the long journey they had made only the previous day. They were not fit to cover the distance by nightfall, and before long they had worse to face than their own fatigue and low spirits. Bad news travels fast, and going down to Caesar's Belt and beyond, the rumor had spread that the terrible General Woundwort and his Ausla had been cut to pieces on top of Watership Down, and that what was left of them was now trailing southwards in poor shape, with little heart to stay alert. And the 1,000 began to close in. Stoats, a fox, even a tomcat from a farm. At every halt, yet another rabbit was not to be found, and no one could remember seeing what had happened. One of these was Vervain. It had been plain from the start that he had nothing left, and indeed there was very little reason for him to return to Ephrata without his general. And through all the fear and hardship, Campion remained steady and vigilant, holding the survivors together, thinking ahead, and encouraging the exhausted to keep going. And during the afternoon of the following day, while the off-4 mark were at Silflay, he came limping through the sentry line with a straggling handful of 6 or 7 rabbits. He was close to collapse himself, and scarcely able to give the council any account of the disaster. Only Groundsel and Thistle and 3 others had the presence of mind to dart down the opened run when the dog had arrived. Back in the honeycomb, Groundsel immediately surrendered himself and his fugitives to Fiver, who was still bemused from his long trance, and scarcely restored to his senses sufficiently to grasp what was happening. At length, however, after the 5 Afrafans had remained crouching for some time in the burrow, listening to the sounds of the dog hunting above, Fiver recovered himself fully, and made his way to the mouth of the run, where Bigwig still lay half-conscious, and succeeded in making Holly and Silver understand that the siege was over. There was no lack of helpers to tear open the blocked runs in the south wall. It so happened that Bluebell was the first through into the honeycomb, and for many days after he was still improving upon his imitation of Captain Fiver at the head of his crowd of Afrafan prisoners. Oh, I don't know, like a blue jay rounding up a bunch of crows, as he put it. No one was inclined to pay them much attention at the time, however, for the only thoughts throughout the warren were for Hazel and Bigwig. Bigwig seemed likely to die. Bleeding from half a dozen places, he lay with closed eyes in the run he had defended, and could make no reply when Hyacinthe told him that the Afrafans were defeated and the warren was saved. After a time they dug carefully to broaden the run, and as the days wore on, the does, each in turn, remained beside him, tending to his wounds, and listening to his low, unsteady breathing. Before this, Blackberry and Dandelion had burrowed their way in from Kihar's Run. It had not been blocked very heavily, and they told their story. Dandelion could not say what might have happened to Hazel after the dog broke loose, and by the early afternoon everyone feared the worst. At last, Pipkin, in great anxiety and distress, insisted on setting out for Nuthanger Farm. Fiver at once said that he would go with him, and together they left the woods and set off northwards over the down. They had only gone a short distance when Fiver, sitting on top of an anthill as a lookout, saw a rabbit approaching over the high ground to the west. They both ran nearer and recognized Hazel. Fiver went to meet him, while Pipkin raced back to the honeycomb with the news. As soon as he had learned all that had happened, including what Groundsel had to tell, Hazel asked Holly to take 2 or 3 rabbits and find out for certain whether the Efrafans had really left. And then he himself went into the run where Bigwig was lying. Hyacinthe looked up as he came. "He was awake a little while ago, Hazelraw," she said. "He asked where you were, and then he said his ear hurt very much." Hazel nuzzled at the matted fur cap. The blood had turned hard, and made spikes that prickled his nose. "You've done it, Bigwig," he said. "They've all run away." But for several moments Bigwig did not move, and then he opened his eyes and raised his head, puffing out his cheeks and sniffing at the 2 rabbits beside him. He said nothing, and Hazel wondered whether he understood. At last he whispered, "Is finish Mr. Voonvoort, ja?" "Ja," replied Hazel. "I've come to help you silflay. It'll do you some good, and we can clean you up a lot better outside. Come on, it's a lovely afternoon. It's all sun and leaves out there." Bigwig got up and tottered forward into the devastated honeycomb. There he sank down, rested, got up again, and reached the foot of Kihar's Run. "I thought he'd killed me," he said. "There's no more fighting for me. I've had enough. And your plan worked, Hazelraw, did it? Well done. Now tell me what it was. And how did you get back from the farm?" "A man brought me in a hurdudu," said Hazel. "Nearly all the way." "And you flew the rest, I suppose," said Bigwig. "Burning a white stick in your mouth? Oh, come on, Hazelraw. Tell me sensibly. What's the matter, Hyacinthe?" "Oh," said Hyacinthe, staring. "Oh. Well, what is it? He did?" "Did what?" "He did ride home in a hurdudu, and I saw him as he came, that night back in Efrafa, when I was with you in your burrow. Do you remember?" "Huh, I remember," said Bigwig. "I remember what I said, too. I said you better tell it to my friend Fiver. That's a good idea. Let's go and do that. And if he believes you, Hazelraw, then I will."